So this is our second summer session talk for NLG. We're super excited that everyone showed up. Today we have Professor Baker, our amazing faculty advisor, is going to speak to us about hopefully some clinics that is going on at Pepperdine, trying to figure out our schedules this fall. And he's been great at Pepperdine, teaches a lot of, leads a lot of clinics. Right now, in this summer session, you're teaching, what is it, law and practice in times of crisis, right?
Well, I was planning on it, but we didn't have enough students enroll. So it was just an experiment that failed. That's okay.
Hopefully we'll get a little bit then right now. We'll listen, we'll be your class. But yeah, I want to go ahead and get started and welcome Professor Baker. Thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thank you all. It's a privilege, and I'm very happy to spend time with you. And I'm very grateful to be NLG's faculty advisor, and I want to commend you all in the organization and those of you who are just tuning in that it's really good work to mobilize during the summer. It's hard to bring things together in the summer, and as we were saying before everybody got in, if there's any benefit from our current plague, it's that it gives us some flexibility to gather in ways that we wouldn't otherwise get to and organize in ways that we otherwise can't. And so I'm proud of your student initiative this summer, and especially seizing the moment that we're facing right now in the country. And I'm very, very happy to be here with you, and thankful for the time. Now, Cooper and I were laughing a little bit about the billing for this event. I may not hit all the marks, but I'm going to try to stay in bounds and to say some good stuff. I'm approaching this in a couple of ways. I'm thinking about how best to be an activist or an advocate during law school, but as a clinical teacher, I'm always thinking about preparing students at this professional moment in your life to join the bar and the practice and to engage. So everything that I say about clinics and everything I say about what you can do in law school always to me is with having in mind teaching and preparation and training for practice and what you're going to do. So I wanted to talk a little bit about since it's summertime and a little bit looser, I'm going to tell some stories, and I'm going to ask you for some engagement too. I can't just talk as a clinic teacher without asking you for some insight. So if I call on you, just answer it. This isn't a graded class today. So if I call on you, it's only out of love. But I want to talk a little bit about activism and advocacy as it relates to some of the issues that we're having right now, but also just what it means to be a lawyer and how to identify how we can engage with the world and the issues that we see. And I'm going to talk about clinics and externships and stuff toward the end with some practical things, but I'd like to theoretically suss some stuff out with you. And I want to start by talking about activism sort of generally and what that means. Activism can mean, activism is, sort of a general term. It's sort of the activity of trying to make change. And that's not a partisan activity. I think anyone who literally, as the word implies, takes action to try to bring change to the world is an activist, is a kind of activist. One time my grandmother told me that when we were back in Alabama, my grandmother goes to a pretty small church in a small town in Alabama. And we were in the same, I was teaching at a school that was affiliated with the Churches of Christ, sort of like Pepperdine is back there. And my grandmother overheard someone in her church mention me while she was standing around the corner. And one of them said, "Oh, he's that activist," as if it were a bad thing. And I was sort of like, yeah, I'll take that. It just means someone who's trying to make change and who's trying to bring change to the world. But it can be a little bit ambiguous, right? And it can be about anything. And I'm mindful of some wisdom that I heard one time from a lawyer named Fred Gray. Fred Gray is easily in his 90s now. Some of you may have heard of him. He's a legendary black lawyer in Alabama, in Tuskegee. And Mr. Gray, who is still practicing at his firm in Tuskegee, was 23 or 24 years old when he came back to the South from law school. He grew up in Montgomery, went to Alabama State University and HBCU in Montgomery, and then could not in the 50s go to law school in Alabama. So he went to Case Western Reserve in Cleveland, and he came back to Alabama with a mission, in his words, to find segregation everywhere he could and destroy it. And he was, at 23, 24 years old, the lawyer for Rosa Parks and Dr. King when he was a 24, 25-year-old pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. So I'm telling you, young lawyers can have a difference, right? And Mr. Gray ended up being the counsel that prosecuted Browder versus Gale, which desegregated the busing system after the bus boycott in Montgomery. He was in court to get the court order from Frank Johnson for the marchers to cross the Selma Edmund Pettus Bridge and march to Montgomery. And he was Rosa Parks' lawyer at the jail to get her out and to help with her prosecution and the lawsuit later on. Anyway, Mr. Gray says this: every movement needs marchers and every movement needs lawyers. And usually the lawyers shouldn't be the marchers. And that's because, as he joked, somebody needs to get the marchers out of jail. But I think what he really meant is that lawyers have a very specific and broad, but specific role to play in any kind of movement and in any kind of search for justice. So today, we're talking about activism sort of generally, but I specifically want to talk about lawyers because it's law school and that's what we do and that's what you're training to do. We could talk about community organizing. We could talk about public demonstrations. We could talk about civil disobedience. We could talk about lobbying and all of the things that happen to sort of change the law. And that can be lawyering as well. But what I really want to settle our conversation in is a sense of how we can best be good, effective lawyers and law students as you prepare for practice. I consider law students to be professionals. You are not waiting to be professionals. You have joined the profession. You are just at this particular stage of the profession. I practice law with law students constantly and without ceasing, and I get to see what law students do in the world, not just studying about it, but actually taking action. So let's talk today about how to be some of the ways that we can be effective lawyers and effective professional law students as we confront systemic injustice. And systemic injustice itself is big and amorphous and hard to pin down. And it's really a fabric of overlapping, sometimes even well-intentioned policies and laws, functional operations, cultures, social expectation, biases, law and politics, and all these things. So it's sometimes easy to say we're going to confront systemic injustice, but sometimes it's difficult to unwind the precise issues and the precise things that we're talking about. In fact, I had in my graduate class, in our Masters of Legal Studies class, I had a student write to me and we had a good long discussion about the differences between the civil rights movements in the 60s and the current movement, which we might call Black Lives Matter or defunding the police or whatever is happening in our world, like our current 2020 movements, which are really ongoing from the civil rights movements and not separate at all. But in the 1960s, the racial bias and the racial inequities and injustices were written into the law. And so sometimes those legal battles were far more direct and far more targeted with specific outcomes. So for instance, desegregating public transportation in the South. That's a specific legal goal. Integrating schools is a specific legal goal. Advocating for the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, specific legal goals, which were successful in large and continuing over time in many ways. We just had this sort of extraordinary Supreme Court moment to assure that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act applies to people who are gay and LGBT and trans, and that is a continuing legal, strategy. But we also see that the law is only part of this, right? And sometimes society affects the law. Sometimes law affects the society. I think these things are happening all at once. And right now, what we're seeing, I think, if we can measure success of this current movement, or at least the real effect of this movement, is much more cultural and market-based and socially based. And it is attacking systemic things that are not even necessarily legally systemic, but they are culturally systemic and politically systemic, like Mississippi, my home state, at long last taking down the Confederate battle flag. NASCAR, that NFL football team in Washington deciding to probably very likely get rid of its racist mascot. And that's because market pressures are pushing them in that way. And the market pressures are responding to social pressures, and the social pressures are responding to the movement and the things that are going on right now. So it's hard sometimes for lawyers to know where to fit in that. And it's also this, no one ever thinks that they are the villain. I mean, even George Wallace didn't think he was the villain. And it's hard sometimes when we can sit around and think, okay, we're going to beat our enemy. And I think in a democracy that ends up being really quite dangerous. And so part of this is persuasion, part of this is movement, part of this is a moral reckoning, part of it is legal, and much of it is, it's all political. And so trying to figure out where we fit into that and how we approach it as activists and advocates for a particular cause is important. Now, defunding the police, for instance, if that's your ambition, is less about law and much, I mean, law in the sense that we typically think of it is law in the sense that a budget is the law. But a budget ends up being a political document. So these are things that we're talking about now. Qualified immunity, that's a specific legal target. Certain issues that people want to address can be certain legal arguments, but otherwise, lawyering matters in different ways in different movements. Context matters, details matter, facts and storytelling matter. And so I'm going to tell you some stories and raise some issues, and then I'm going to ask you to think about how lawyers and legal advocacy, whatever that means, can be important. So I'm about to tell you my first story. Actually, by now it's like your third story, but that's okay. This is the first story I'm going to ask you about. So first story that I want you to think about critically as I tell it, and then either you can raise your hands because there's not too many of us, or drop it in the chat. But I want you to listen to my story, and I want you to think about how to address the issues, whatever they are, in the story that I tell. So it's a true story. And this is the story of my family, and it's sort of an American dream story. So my father was born in 1948. In fact, this is his birthday today. He's 72 in Alabama, and he's a twin. They were born in 1948 to sharecroppers, literal, I would say very poor, extremely uneducated tenant farmers in North Arkansas. In 1948, they lived in a shack they did not own. They actually had no indoor plumbing. My dad was is a twin. But they didn't know that there was a twin coming until the twin came, because there was no prenatal care at all. My grandfather had a 4th grade education, which was more than my grandmother had. And so they were extremely poor people in the South, dirt farmers. And when my dad was 3 in 1951, maybe 1950, my grandfather moved the family to Indianapolis, Indiana. And he was able to get a job at a pipe factory, a union factory job in Indiana, in Indianapolis. And along with that came eligibility through a post-war program called actually a New Deal program that ramped up after World War II, called FHA loans, Federal Housing Administration. So they were able to get an FHA loan for a house, a 900 square foot house in what then was sort of the suburbs of Indianapolis, a working class neighborhood. It's the 900 square foot house that they lived in for the whole rest of their lives until they passed away, my grandparents, several years ago. And my dad then and his siblings were able to go to a brand new, very large public high school in the outskirts of Indiana, while my grandfather supported the family of 5 with, actually 6, with his union job. My dad then went, after high school, he worked in the factory for a while, and then he went to the Army. He was a helicopter pilot in Vietnam. He learned how to fly helicopters. And then after Vietnam, after he was shot down and got 2 Purple Hearts, came home, and he ended up being a crop duster over fields in North Alabama with my uncle. So he learned how to fly in the Army, and then he was flying over cotton fields in North Alabama, a step up, quite a step up from dirt farmers in North Arkansas. So he had a profession, he had a skill, he had a high school degree, and he married my mom, who was studying at that point to become an English teacher, which she did. So I was born in 1975. They lived in a trailer for a while, and then bought a house, and they're now retired in North Alabama. But my mom was a school teacher. My dad was a helicopter pilot, and they were able to send me to live. And my mother obviously values education, so I went to high school, went to college, and they were able to pay for my college. And then I was able to then I was the almost first person in my family on that side to graduate from college. My cousin beat me by 2 weeks, but it took her 8 years to go to college, so I still sort of claim it. Anyway, then I went to law school at Vanderbilt, and nobody on that side of the family had ever done anything like that. I became a lawyer, practiced in Mississippi, taught in Alabama, now live in Malibu, and I've got teenagers now who are going to Malibu High School, taking summer classes at Santa Monica College. My oldest daughter got to play Carnegie Hall last year with the orchestra. They are having, so within 3 generations, from the dirt farm in North Arkansas to kids growing up in Malibu on a college campus and having the world at their feet. That is an extraordinary American story. But here's where systemic issues come into play. Those union jobs back in the 1950s were still segregated, and there was real hardship for Black people or people of color to get the jobs that my grandfather got and to be in a union. But even more importantly than that, FHA loans were not available to Black people. And not available to Black people, at least in any way, to the extent that they were for white people. So my grandparents, with a 4th grade education and a factory job, were able to buy a house. And what we know about that is it starts to create generational wealth and set people on a trajectory that goes up. We also, in our country, fund public schools based on local property taxes. So those movements and programs in the 50s meant that white people could move out of the inner city and become homeowners instead of renters, which they had been before World War II. And owning their own home created increased property values, which increased school funding, and which increased the quality of life and the ability for white families to start to get out of the kind of poverty that they were in before World War II and the New Deal. Black families weren't available for that. And so what had been basically integrated inner cities became predominantly Black inner cities, especially in the Midwest and upper Midwest and the North. And then those families went to poor schools. They could only be renters. They couldn't build institutional wealth. And so the families that were poor and uneducated in the 50s, if you could get a loan and a house and move out, then your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren might end up living in Malibu, based on the strength of those steps that went up because of those programs to buy a house and to fund public education. If you were Black in the 50s, before we discovered and decided that we as a nation, that the Constitution ought to apply to Black people in a specific way, and we ought to have civil rights laws, then that trajectory could never take off. And so what we see is, as a matter of systemic injustice, generational changes, and a generational trajectory that is based in public policy. But now, since the 60s, since the 70s, since we've changed, we could look at the laws that we have now and say, well, everybody has a fair shot now. There's no limitation on who can buy a house. There's no limitation on where you can live. There's constitutional protections against discrimination in housing and education, but that doesn't account for the 4 generations that came before it, because we're really just one, maybe 1.5 generations past that. So, so that's my story and the way that we benefit from it, and it is extraordinary. And so I want to ask you now, because I ask you to put your lawyer and your law student hats on, how can we, and Carla already dropped a suggestion, maybe not the only suggestion, how can the law or lawyers now address either the trajectories that we want to create for people starting now, and how can lawyers address those kinds of generational inequities that still skew radically the family wealth and the family sort of opportunities that come between people in poverty or not, and that correlates to, in our country, race. So just brainstorm with me. What could lawyers do about either the present or the past, or catching the present up to the past, or anything? Just brainstorm with me. I think I don't know how the moderators want to handle this, but there aren't too many of us. And so I feel like you can just unmute or drop something in the chat if you want, or raise your electronic hand or your real hand.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start just to see what everyone else thinks. I kind of struggle with this myself. I'm a big person that thinks that you should be involved in politics and policy as well as, learning the law. So I think my way of looking at this has been through politics and policy, trying to get policy passed, whether that's talking to members of Congress, local people to provide some type of compensation, I guess you would say, that would I guess it would be a sort of reparations, like I've posted there. That's just an idea from Ta-Nehisi Coates, but I do love his article, and it is kind of what made me think about a reparation type of policy. But yeah, I guess my thought has always been, how as a lawyer can I do this, affect this change as a lawyer, separate from, being involved in politics, or even if that should be separated, I'm not sure. So I'm interested to see what everyone else thinks.
Keep going. Someone else. How can we talk about these things now or going forward? Well, let me just say, lawyers. No, who was going to talk? Amy, go in.
I'll raise my real hand. I don't have a great suggestion, but it was very informative for me to take individual rights with Professor Goodman and learn a lot more about how Justice Thomas has sided typically always against classifying people by race. And I think it's too much pressure on the one Black justice to decide on behalf of all people of color for the country. But so that maybe that's one suggestion, is to get more judges of color in our system. But I just think his perspective tends to boil down to separating people by race has been a problem, and flipping it to support people who are of color doesn't solve it. And I think there's some truth to that, but I think if that's what's at the peak of our system, any lower court decisions are going to be really hard. And so I think it's going to take very careful wording. And this is another place where I think having more people of color in the system would help. If the lawyers making these arguments are not white, I think they may have a better perspective, or just a more rich perspective, than a bunch of white lawyers telling Black judges how they should decide about race.
Yes. Who's going? Who's next?
I'll go if that's okay.
Yeah, McKenna.
So one thing that I was thinking about too is also how, mass incarceration, even though Black people may still have more access to housing, there are still so many systems in place that work to keep them down. Black people and other people of color as well, but that trap them into cycles of debt and, court fees, all these kinds of things, where it's like, even though maybe they have access to housing, they can't even pay for it. And so it's things like ensuring that housing is a human right, and like reforming the prison system, and like so many things like that are just huge. But I think that would be really helpful.
That's great. And I love, yes, McKenna, and that's actually going to lead me to my second story. And I love that I love these ideas that you're rolling in here. Almost all of them so far, except for Marielle Siders, are truly systemic, like policy-driven things. Marielle is talking about increasing access to justice for individuals so that they can stay out sort of the cycle as they go, which I think is really, really important. McKenna, let me use your point to jump off on my second story. And this is, I'm only telling Southern stories because I'm from the South, but there are plenty of stories about this otherwise. So my last few months in Montgomery, I got a ticket for rolling through a stop sign, which I didn't agree with, but nonetheless, it was a young African-American police officer who pulled me over. In fact, both of them were African-American police officers. He was very junior. He was super nervous. I felt like I needed to help him figure out how to give me a ticket better. But I mean, I was never in fear, right? I was never afraid. It was not a confrontation, and it wasn't something that I couldn't pay, and it was close enough call that I wasn't going to try to fight it. So I just decided to go to pay it. So I go down to the municipal courthouse in Montgomery, and I'm standing in a long line full of people waiting to pay their tickets. And I look up at a little piece of paper that's taped to a column inside the room where we are, in this big room with our winding sort of, Disney style line to get up to the windows. And it says, pay your ticket online. And I was like, well, yeah. So I just walk outside on my phone, pay my ticket, and go home. Super easy. And anybody in the room could have done that. They just didn't have the sign well posted. And so I'm not saying that particular thing is a systemic injustice, but the fact that I was able to just handle it like that is a function of wealth, and a function of sophistication, and a function of being able to just do it. But here's a problem that is a real problem. And it is the rolling cascade that comes from minor infractions and minor misdemeanor traffic style stuff. So if you have, let's say you just get a minor traffic ticket like I did, let's say you can't pay it because you're poor, or you don't have insurance. And so if you get pulled over and you don't have insurance, those are all laws. There's not anything like discriminatory about needing to not stop at a stop sign and have insurance. But it becomes a function of wealth, and it becomes a function of other things. And then because we don't have a right to counsel for misdemeanors in state court, people can just start to roll up, right? And if they don't come because they can't pay for it, if someone can't pay for their ticket so they don't show up, then they get an arrest warrant out for them for failing to appear. Then when they show up, if they don't show up, it just starts to compound and compound and compound. And it becomes such a problem that then people can't come into the system for fear of being actually locked up, right? And being locked up in jail or in prison in many, many states, in fact, I would say all states, is going to be dangerous. We know that there are racial disparities, and this gets down to whether you can afford a lawyer to come help you, whether you're sophisticated enough to get out. And we start to see the function of poor education and a lack of wealth, which is still tied in most places to race because of the history that I just said. Then it just compounds. And there's nothing about that is particularly racist, except that it ends up being racial because of all of these systemic problems. And in Montgomery, about 20 years ago, long before I got there was an asylum program. And the asylum was, if you just come pay off your tickets, we're not going to arrest anybody. You can just come pay them off, no fees, no penalties, just come pay it off. Let's clear it off. The city was going to make millions of dollars. And people started showing up to line up under an amnesty program so that they could just come sign it, get their records clear, and everything was going to be fine. So people start lining up outside the courthouse for their amnesty. And then after everybody's sort of in line, the police come through and start arresting people. And it was just a complete trap. And what that ends up doing is not only is it like duplicitous and dishonest and kind of horrible at taking advantage of people's experiences, it actually absolutely undercuts anybody's trust in the police department, right? Because then you're like, well, I'm not going to trust anything you say anymore now. And it took a long time. Now, Montgomery's a very different place. Montgomery actually has a black mayor now and a white chief of police, and they have had an excellent so far reaction to de-escalating and keeping protests and Black Lives Matters protests lately very peaceful and not escalated by the police and other things. So it's learned a lot of lessons. But those things happen in a lot of places, and they end up being sort of racialized. And that is a systemic cycle that is very hard to break. And it's very hard to pin down, because nothing that I said is like de jure racist, right? It ends up being sort of de facto racialized. And my last note about this is going back to Amy's point. I believe that Justice Thomas's ideal, if that's how we're going to describe it, of color blindness is actually really, really admirable. That getting to a point where we are literally judged on the content of our character and not the color of our skin is something that we ought to think about. And Justice Roberts, when they eviscerated the Voting Rights Act a couple of years ago, was largely saying, well, racism is passed because it's not illegal. I mean, it's not legal anymore. But what we know is that those policies echo with a legacy that push out in very different ways. As Michael says in the chat, they're disparate impacts. And I also want us to remember this. If we and other people get really tired of talking about identity politics and talking about things in racial terms, I think we always need to remember that those identity categories came from white people in power. The ability to talk about black and white churches, black and white schools, black and white everything are a function of white people not allowing black people to participate. Or in California, not allowing Mexican people to participate or Chinese people to participate. And so the racialized laws and the racialized categories, even of like straightness and men and women, they come in the law from the people who were in charge. And so those things still resonate. If they don't resonate legally anymore, they do absolutely, in my opinion, still resonate culturally. And I actually think that's a pretty easy argument to make that they still do. So anyway, based on what I just said, how about that story? How do we address that kind of injustice as lawyers? Not just necessarily marching in the street, but what are the things that we as lawyers ought to do and try to do?
This is Caitlin. My initial thoughts are, something that actually we had talked about earlier in the school year, back when we were able to sit next to each other and share a microphone during open conversations, where the question came up about, what is a crime? What defines a crime? And something I had talked about, and something that I've believed kind of for a long time, is that it's a crime to be poor. And directly speaking to, for example, that you can accidentally park somewhere, or maybe you forgot to move your car, and the next thing you know, you're in jail. And so my first reaction is like, okay, so who's putting these people in jail? Who's deciding that this is something I want to prosecute or pursue? And so my initial thought is district attorneys. I feel like we need to get people in those positions who wouldn't want to press charges on something like that, and changing the people in power from that point of view. If I were to get a report on my desk of a kid who just, look, because you can see the history. You can see, okay, he failed to show up for a ticket. Why? Because he couldn't afford it, or because he was at work and couldn't afford to miss work. That's something I would toss, right? So I don't know. I think that would be my first initial practical step. But I guess the question always becomes then, you're at the end of the day, you're going to have a boss, and that boss is going to make you do things. And so I don't know how that's something I've been struggling with.
So hard. Yes. And I strongly believe that we need good, righteous lawyers as prosecutors, as defenders, as plaintiffs' lawyers, as defense lawyers, as corporate counsel. I mean, anybody who's going to help someone approach justice. So I am not anti-prosecutor like at all. I want there to be great prosecutors out there in the world, but you point a finger on something that I think is actually really, really important. So many, and I mean, I've known so many over the course of my 14 years of law teaching of people who want, and this was me, by the way, I didn't end up going into prosecution, but I went to law school to be a prosecutor, and I've never done it. And I believe that we need to have people in there, but the pressures. A line DA does not have that much discretion, right? So a young person coming in as a line DA doesn't have as much discretion or power, and you still have to play the game in order to rise just a little bit, right? To get up where you want to go. Now, that I think you ought to try. I think you just need to guard your heart. Of course, that's true of all law practice. I think you need to guard your heart and stick to what you're trying to do. But to be within the system, I mean, there's always this huge debate, right? Do you get more change inside or outside the system? I think we need both. And so I want to like really commend your observation there, because I think it's really important. Are you cheering for me, Caitlin, or is your hand back up?
No, cheering.
Okay, good. So an interesting story on this point. Nashville, the Nashville DA this week said that Nashville Davidson County District Attorney's Office will no longer prosecute for possession of less than half an ounce of marijuana. And the quote, I just pulled it up: marijuana charges do little to promote public health and even less to promote public safety. Demographic statistics indicate that these charges impact minorities in a disproportionate manner, and the policy will eliminate this area of disproportionately in the justice system. I mean, that is a DA, not an activist DA, not a so-called progressive prosecutor like we see in California, in Nashville, making just a very modest change, and people are calling him a traitor. And one lawmaker in Tennessee called it treason, and saying that you're violating the law by refusing to enforce the law. And you're getting outside your zone because it ought to be up to the legislature to decide what ought to be a crime. I mean, prosecutorial discretion almost always is deciding where to put resources about what crime to produce, right? To prosecute. And so that's a great example of what this looks like and what it is. So yeah, Tennessee represent. David, it's fantastic. Those are great things. Let me add no more long stories, but I will tell you some statistics that you're probably well familiar with, but I want to raise to you. Think about this: of women in prison in the United States, solid data indicate that about 90% of women who are incarcerated in prison nationally and in states have a history of being victims of domestic violence and sexual assault during their lives. I used to represent, in fact, during my time in Alabama, literally hundreds of domestic violence victims. That's the kind of clinic I ran in Alabama. And what we know about domestic violence is that being a victim of domestic violence, especially over a prolonged time, and that doesn't even mean like violence, physical violence, it can be abuse, it can be emotional coercion, financial coercion, other things, create the same kind of neurological trauma as a soldier in combat. We know that neurologically and physiologically, it is the same, trauma looks the same to someone who has been hypervigilant and under the gun in a domestic violence relationship as someone who has been in combat. In 2004, it's a little bit dated, but Black women were 4.5 times more likely than white women to be incarcerated. 2/3, according to the ACLU, 2/3 of women in prison are women of color. And African-American women's incarceration rates for all crimes increased by 800% since 1986, the war on drugs. And that is an increase of 800% for Black women, 400% for women of all races, but 90% of them had a history of being victims of domestic violence. Now I'll raise that next to this next set of data. Y'all probably know this because it comes up a lot in these conversations in LA, but the 3 largest mental health facilities in the United States are county jails: Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York City. LA County Jail, the Twin Towers, is the largest mental health facility in the United States. 1/3 of all inmates were receiving mental health treatment in 2019. And an LA County study found that 60% of the people who were receiving mental health treatment in LA County Jail could instead be safely cared for in the community if there were enough housing and community services. So we are largely treating jail as an asylum. I'm reading these statistics again. Something like 5,500 out of 17,000 inmates in jail were getting psychotropic medication or were being held in mental health housing units in jail. So if we see that 90% of women who are in jail were traumatized by domestic violence and sexual assault at some point during their life, and at least 1/3 of all people who are in LA County Jail are receiving mental health treatment, and at least 60% of those could be treated elsewhere. What are some, I'm going to assume that in this audience for NLG that you're opposed to that, that you think that's a bad thing. So if that's something that we're trying to address, what are some things that lawyers can do? What are some of the legal things that we can engage with in order to address those issues? Just think creatively, like lawyers, locally, globally, individually, systemically.
Man, my hand was in.
Let's go Marielle, then Michael.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just thinking individually in terms of treating your client, not just for their crime, but as a person, and, you know, suggesting those types of services that are available, but also systemically, you know, like with the drug court program in Los Angeles, like encouraging alternate forms of, you know, consequences for the commission of those crimes. That's all.
Yes, good. Michael, yeah.
So I was going to say one thing that courts and judges and prosecutors primarily could do is take trauma-informed approaches to, interacting with criminals, for lack of a better word at the moment. I just recently watched a documentary on human trafficking. I believe it was Operation Toussaint. Fantastic film. And it was just such an inspiration because the officers in that film weren't treating prostitutes as criminals, but as victims and survivors of trafficking. And that led not only to better outcomes for the survivors, but also to prosecutions of the people trafficking them. In addition, I think it would be good for prosecutors as well as defense attorneys to take a step back and I suppose check their privilege. I'm at a bit of a loss of words, but just ask themselves if they're really doing everything they can for somebody, and ask why they're doing it. Is it because they think this person is savable because of how they look or like their, you know, monetary or familial background, or is it because each person deserves dignity and an advocate? That's all.
I'm glad that you said that, and glad Marielle raised drug court. I'm pretty familiar with Veterans Court in California, and especially Ventura County. And we have, and now I'll start getting into my pitch, we have a Veterans Law Practicum, which works with a public defender in Ventura County in Veterans Court. And it is, as Michael just said, trauma-informed practice. And this actually gives me quite a lot of hope. California has some pretty progressive and creative rules and laws for mental health courts, for drug courts, and they work with varying effect depending on the resources in the community. But Ventura County, and in fact, I think better than LA County, does a great job with Veterans Treatment Court. And this is what it looks like. Some of y'all are familiar with this and you've heard me talk about it, but a Veterans Treatment Court in Ventura County, using California statute, says that if a person who is engaged with the criminal justice system can demonstrate a nexus between their charge and their service, or a trauma that they experienced or an injury that they served in service, then they can have diversionary sentencing into a therapeutic course, not a penal course. And so, for instance, someone, let's say, has a DUI or a burglary, but they can show that they suffered PTSD because they were in service, or military sexual trauma, or a traumatic brain injury. And when they got home, they didn't have sufficient resources. They started self-medicating. They have depression and trauma. And then they end up becoming dependent on drugs or alcohol. And then that leads to the DUI or the burglar or whatever. Then if they can show that there's a nexus between their service and what they did, which is basically the trauma-informed approach that Michael just talking about, then that puts them on a path toward a customized approach. And this is what I love about it. I've been to these meetings before where the prosecutor, the public defender, probation, Veterans Treatment Court, social workers, and a court representative are all sitting around a table creating and crafting a customized program for that person. And that person ends up going through this cycle of like occupational therapy, drug rehab, housing, mandatory therapy, and resources. And then when they finish that course successfully, if they do, then they graduate from the program. They're not sentenced, right? And it goes into a different way. And now the threat of incarceration and the threat of real life penal activity is always in the background. That's the motivation. But getting people into that process is taking a real serious care about someone's trauma in their life and the context and what brought them there, and thinking in a creative, therapeutic way about how to actually rehabilitate them and put them in a position of being sort of contributing members of society and helping them sort of turn the corner. Rather than being put as grist into our penal system that just grinds people up and has huge rates of recidivism and abuse and all of the things that we know. So I actually think there's a lot of hope in that. And treating, for instance, people who are trafficked, women who are trafficked as victims or as people in need of treatment, as opposed to criminals, takes their trauma very seriously. Now, the risk of that in the law is that you can end up with unequal outcomes, which we always put a high premium on, saying that, like cases ought to equal like cases. And it seems less efficient because it takes a lot more work on the front end. And it seems like it's going to be potentially uneven for people as they're coming through the process. My response to that critique is it's super way cheaper than putting people in jail for a long time. And super way cheaper than just putting people in a box for years and then hoping that they come out not less traumatized. We have a family friend whose adult daughter did 2 years of time on a criminal drug charge. Of course, it was a criminal charge, a drug charge. And when she got out of, she was doing federal time, but at a facility in San Diego, at a state facility in San Diego. And when they released her, they brought her in chains on a bus in shackles to downtown Los Angeles at 10 o'clock at night and put her off the bus with a whole bunch of other people who were being released from jail, took her shackles off in the middle of the sidewalk at a bus stop in downtown Los Angeles at 10 o'clock at night and drove away. Now that is not, her father was able to come get her. She's had a great, stories since then. But if you just drop people off in the middle of the night in downtown LA, you're almost guaranteeing that they're going to find themselves back in their way. So these are problems that are are part of the great whole, I think. Very specific practices that are very hard to target sometimes because they get sort of lost in the big picture. But they're a big deal. Okay, that's a whole lot of talking. Let me land this just a little bit in 7 minutes. In law school, now clearly I'm biased and I'm about to pitch every program that I run, but this is where I think we get to do the best stuff. So what I hope you'll take from some of this discussion is that we don't have a clinic that says, okay, we're battling systemic injustice. Because as you've seen, those are all like these overlapping webs of lots of things. Sometimes there are big picture policy issues. And if you want to do big picture policy stuff, then you can work out an externship or a job or something that is going to put you in a position of working on policy. You can work with people who are addressing policy issues. Amy, I'm calling on you again, but didn't I see that you have a policy job with this summer on LinkedIn?
I did. I just finished a lobbying job, but now I'm at DOJ, which is very cool issues of disparate violence.
Good. So see, you have opportunities. Thank you for letting me use it as an object lesson. Externships and positions of working on policy, and then working for the government like that to be able to leverage your ability to do good work within the system. You can do externships with DAs and learn the roles. You can do externships with public defenders and do the work. Like, externships are our academic mechanism to get you to do almost anything that you want to for credit in law school. So that you don't have to do it on top of your curriculum. It gets built into the curriculum. So whatever your cause, whatever your mechanism, whatever your work, we can work with you, and you can find ways to be able to leverage your summer, your semesters to build expertise in the kind of work that you want to do. That's externships, and that's the broadest term. And of course, in the spring, I mean, Lord willing, and if the plague ends, you could do that in DC in our externship and DC program, all semester full-time jobs. Working in courts, I think as a law student, as a clerk, is a way for you to be able to build your credentials. Clinics are direct legal services to clients who are facing some of these things. Our legal aid clinic downtown on Skid Row, led by Professor Brittany Stringfellow Odie, it's our oldest clinic. It is representing people who are in dire and extreme poverty and homelessness in Los Angeles. And it's a civil clinic. It's not a criminal defense clinic. It's not a unlawful detainer eviction defense clinic. It's helping people break cycles of poverty. So it's helping them make sure that they have access to healthcare benefits, public benefits, mental health, all of the things that start to empower individuals. And I want to say, as lawyers, we can take systemic approaches and we can try to have policy. But I think most commonly, especially if we're civil attorneys, the work that we can do is for individuals to try to empower those individuals, to try to get them through and to navigate and to get over the systemic barriers in their way so that they can have more power and dignity and resources in their own lives. We can't come to everybody's rescue. What we can do is empower our clients to get there. We have the low-income taxpayer clinic, which is tax law, but it's doing the same thing. It's helping people get out from under the cycle of rolling financial crises that then allow them to break cycles of poverty and get on with their lives, especially if they've had a criminal conviction, if they've had other things. It's helping them get past those obstacles. The Restoration and Justice Clinic represents victims of domestic violence. It also represents victims of human trafficking to help them get their records expunged, which is going to the point that Michael made earlier, which is helping people who have been in prostitution or been trafficked shake off the residual criminal effects after they are liberated from trafficking. And that allows them to engage with the world in a way that doesn't continue to stigmatize them as criminals when they have actually been the victims of the people who trafficked them. So each of our clinics have a way where you can dig into these issues on individual levels. The clinic that I run is called the Community Justice Clinic, and we represent nonprofits and NGOs who are doing human rights, social justice, economic development work in the United States and abroad. Sometimes just helping them set up their organization so that they can do it sustainably. So we are empowering our clients to be able to do the good work that they do. So sometimes our work is a little bit attenuated from the cause, but we're helping people to build a structure so that they can do that cause well. And then sometimes we are actually doing research about systemic issues and about how to advance our clients' work in the world. One of my most recent projects that we've done over the last several semesters in the clinic was an evaluation of the Trump administration's zero tolerance immigration policies on the border through the lens of international human rights. And that was for a client who asked us to do that work to empower their work in the world as a nonprofit. And then completely self-promoting, that client and I were able to transmit that into a law review article, which we're publishing right now, calling out the Trump administration's human rights violations for child detention and family separations. So I think my bottom line here is, as a lawyer, you can advance justice in almost any area of law, in any kind of law. You don't have to be a litigator with the Southern Poverty Law Center or the ACLU, although that is spectacular, heroic work. You can be a justice-minded lawyer who is thinking about systemic injustice as a prosecutor, as a defender, plaintiff's lawyer, defense lawyer, corporate lawyer, court clerk, all of these things. Some of y'all may know Sarah George. She graduated a couple years ago. She came to school at Pepperdine after having been a Spanish teacher, and really, really has a heart for immigrants and immigration law. She's working for an employer side labor law firm right now, representing management. But she is bringing her justice work to her clients so that they have more just practices for their workers, to avoid liability and to make sure that they're being compliant. She's helping her employers treat their workers better. So even though she's not on the workers' side, she's on the management side, she's still finding an expression of justice in that work. So that's sort of where I think I need to end it now. And I've talked just a whole lot. But let me end you with this. And if you've been around me long, you've probably heard me say something like this before. But, Dr. King famously said, the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice. And sometimes I think we hear that as a bit of a trite cliche, that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice. And sometimes we think, well, things will get better. But what is missing from that is that the arc doesn't bend by itself. We have to bend it. And so we can't just hope and pray that things will get better. We actually have to put our shoulder to the wheel with everyone else so that we can do our part to push it that way. So I hope that's pretty good, Cooper and Carla and everybody on student activism in clinics. So I'm keeping y'all late just by a minute, but I'm happy to stay on for a few minutes. I know people probably have to bail, but any questions, comments, ideas, things you want to talk? Yeah, Miriam.
I have a quick practical question. Are the clinics going to be on site given COVID?
Oh, great question. We're having a mix, actually. And so you should be able to see on the schedule which ones are going to be online and which ones are going to be on ground. Mine is going to be on ground. I live on campus, so that's pretty easy for me to do, but that will only be for the seminar component. Our practice is all remote anyway, because of our clients are usually pretty far away. So we do almost everything by phone and online anyway. But I think the legal aid clinic and some others are going to be online, but you'll be able to see, and there'll be a mix. Yes. Anybody else? I'm glad for your interest.
Thank you so much, Professor Baker, for joining us today. And I just also want to do a quick plug for Monday. We'll have Michael Saavedra, who's a mass incarceration activist. He spent 15 years in solitary confinement and is now advocating, then he successfully sued the California Department of Corrections for his treatment. And now he is advocating to get low-level offenders out of jail just due to COVID. So I think he'll be an interesting speaker to hear from on Monday. And Professor Baker, that was a fascinating talk. And thank you
I know there's some confusion about the subject, but I'm glad it all very connected well together. So thank you so much for being here today.
All right. Much love, y'all. Take care. Stay safe, and can't wait to see you soon whenever we can.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Professor, I actually have a question.
Sure.
For you. I was wondering, what your thoughts are on the recent asks by students that topics like property, contracts discuss, racial disparities, inequalities in the class for those, major classes that we ought to take as 1Ls. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think it's feasible to have professors, mention maybe FHA stuff, and property, or redlining and property? I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Sure. Yes, and I wish everybody would. So let's talk about this from an activist point of view. If you want to see that happen, here's some of the truth about legal education. Professors have, and rightly have, of course I would agree with this, immense discretion over how we teach our classes and what we cover within a specific topic, right? So we have a lot of academic freedom, which we need to have. Now there is going to be, and there are rising, I don't want to say pressure, but rising conversations within the curriculum and within the faculty to address those things more and more and more. It is not something that I'm going to be chair of the curriculum committee this year. I can't tell professors what to teach, and the deans can't either. We can, and I know that Dean Richards is planning to lead some implicit bias training and some other things for the faculty. But that's still probably going to be voluntary. So there's still going to be, some mixed results. But there's going to be work out there. But here's what I would say to you. If this is important to you, student pressure is incredibly, I don't think you recognize quite how powerful y'all can be when you organize and when you lobby faculty. I think it's a real thing. And especially if you express to a teacher with creative, generous kindness that you want to learn something in the law, that puts a huge sort of moral pressure on the teacher to address it, right? So if you're coming into a class with a teacher X, Professor X, and you're taking, subject Y, and you know that there's an issue that you want to discuss or ought to be in there, I honestly say one of the most effective things you can reach out to them is to say, hey, I really want to cover this because I think it's important. It is going to be a hard-hearted teacher who's going to say no to a student who says, I want to cover something. They may say, well, I need to cover this and cover that. But if you stay on it and you build enough folks to say, I want to cover this, then I think that's going to be good. It's going to be hard for us to go back and say, property teachers, you need to teach this. But that can be, but the students can do it. And I'll say this, I hope that you saw this statement that a lot of us signed earlier in the summer. I shared it. That wasn't from the whole faculty, like as a body, but it was almost all of us. And I judge no one who decided not to sign it for their various very important reasons. But if somebody signed that, you can say to us, hey, I saw you sign this and I want to know sort of what it means. And I want to know what it means to this class. And this is what I think you ought to do. Because I think we need to be held accountable to that. And I think if we make a public statement, we know that we're going to be held accountable to it. And so I would say, advocate, be an activist. It's going to be hard to make it happen. I think it'll happen slowly and culturally, but I think that students can help accelerate that a lot.
Okay, great. Thank you. I was wondering because when I was in property, it seemed like a lot of I guess going back to England, of course, right? And the Commonwealth and the big property court cases, big land cases. And I would just sit there thinking okay, well, I live in California and most of us are going to practice in California, right. And I'm not going to be dealing, with huge property acre cases.
Right.
But I guess my confusion was, okay, is this not the class then that I should be looking for this in? Maybe there's upper division courses that's when I'll get my chance to learn those things.
And so my defensive Jedi law professor response to this also is there are some things you need to learn just for the foundation of learning, and to react against that. And so I'm not going to say that, you didn't learn what you were supposed to learn, but learning what you did learn helps you critique what you now need to know in better ways. And so sometimes it's just the progression of education. But the fact that you identify issues that you wish you knew means that your education is working a little bit, actually, because it allows you to lawyer that problem a little bit better. It's not satisfying necessarily, but it's giving you the foundation to be able to think out of new ways. That's my old school response. I don't know if it satisfies or not. But.
Yeah, I appreciate that. My dad's a high school teacher for the last 20 something years and teaches at ABC, one of the community colleges out here. And I've had to push him on to talk about certain things just in his classes, you know? So yeah, I appreciate your feedback. And yeah, I think next time I'll just address them, you know, in person during office hours and talk to them the way I talk to my dad.
Yeah, do it. Advocate. Yeah. Okay, I need to run. It's so good to talk.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody, for having me. It's good to see you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Bye.
Bye.